Welcome to the Journal. I'm Lynn Scherr, sitting in for Bill Moyers, who's away this week. Afghanistan was supposed to be the war that made sense, if any war can be said to make sense. That's where the masterminds behind 9/11 were hiding. End of story. 8 years later, and we're still there, at a cost exceeding $220 billion. More than 1,400 have been killed among American troops and our NATO allies. This week, a classified report from the American commander in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal, was leaked to the press. A report that called for as many as 40,000 additional U.S. troops, without which, the general wrote, our effort, quote, will likely result in failure, end quote. If approved by President Obama, our military force there would escalate to more than 100,000. The president's in a fix. He can accede to the general's wish, despite fading support from Congress and the American public, gambling on success or wading deeper into a Vietnam-like quagmire, or he can cut back, as he's being urged by Vice President Joe Biden and others. They believe we should stop trying to nation build and restore the mission's original intent, protect America from terrorism by concentrating firepower on al-Qaeda. For all its beauty, Afghanistan is a difficult, mountainous land of corrupt warlords, complex alliances, and ancient tribal hatreds. It has defied occupation by outside forces since the time of Alexander the Great, and it is, in the words of my guest, a graveyard of predictions, where nothing is as it seems or goes as planned. Rory Stewart may know Afghanistan better than any other Westerner. A professor and director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, Stewart is a former British soldier and Foreign Service officer. His expertise on the region has gained him the ear of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, U.S. Special Envoy Richard Holbrooke, and the U.S. Senate, where last week he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Back in 2002, shortly after the start of the war in Afghanistan, Stewart traveled the entire country by foot, a death-defying 6,000-mile trek chronicled in his book, The Places in Between. Rory Stewart, welcome to the Journal.
Thank you very much.
Let me start by asking, what in heaven's name made you decide to walk across Afghanistan at a time when there was a war on?
I really believe that in order to talk about a country, you need to spend time in villages. Because this is a country where 80–90% of the population live in villages. And if you spend your time in an embassy compound or dealing with other diplomats or dealing with fancy cabinet ministers, you simply miss the tenor of it. So the privilege for me was that on that walk, and I also walked across Iran, Pakistan, India, and Nepal, I stayed in 500 different village houses. Night after night, I sat on people's floor, I heard them talk about their families, about religion, about the government. By the end of it, I had a little bit more confidence in my work. So if I'm asked, are we going to be able to beat the Taliban and build a state? Having spent some time in those village houses gives me a little bit more confidence in saying, these people may not completely be with the program in the way that you expect.
You write very eloquently about the country, and yet you're a realist. You don't romanticize it. Give us a sense of what it was like from the ground, from the foot walker point of view.
Well, I think one thing is that Afghans were incredibly generous and kind to me. I walked alone from one end of the country to the other at a time when there was no government. So the first lesson I took away from that is how good these communities are in surviving in the absence of a government. It wasn't only they took me into their houses, but they looked after my security. They accompanied me from village to village, often at great personal risk to themselves. So that's the upside. On the other side, of course, I noticed sitting night after night in these village houses that people are quite conservative. They're quite suspicious of foreigners. They don't know a great deal about the outside world. I mean, one of the things that's a little misleading about people who say if we don't fight the Taliban in Afghanistan, we're going to have to fight them in the streets of the United States, is that most of these people we're dealing with can barely read or write. They live very limited lives, where in the winter they're basically holed up in their houses. They're often 3 hours walk from the nearest village. The idea that they're somehow going to turn up on the streets of the United States with a train of goats behind them in order to conduct war here is a bit misleading. They couldn't find the United States on a map.
You talked before about our goals in Afghanistan. The president has a big decision to make. More troops, not more troops. Lay it out. Is that what he's facing?
I think the president has, broadly speaking, defined a very, very narrow objective. He said that we're there to do counterterrorism. That's what he's been saying since January. But then he said in order to get there, we need this huge project which amounts really to building a state. And it's all dressed up in this language of counterinsurgency, fighting the Taliban. So we end up in this paradox where we have this very small objective, which is to protect the United States against terrorist attack. But on the president's there, in order to get there, we need to defeat the Taliban, we need to bring development, we need to create legitimate, effective governmental structures.
And that means, according to the leaked report, either more troops or not more troops.
Absolutely. So the military, which is leading the fight against the Taliban, says that if you really want to build this kind of state, if you really want to defeat the Taliban, we're going to need many more troops. General McChrystal's asked for another 40,000, but when I was testifying at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday, a colonel sitting next to me said they needed 600,000 total, which is both Afghan and US troops, but would be a huge footprint on the ground.
You're saying that what General McChrystal is said to have asked for this is 40,000. You're saying, in fact, that's not going to be the final request?
No, my imagination is that the American military will continue to ask for more and more, because if they're saying 600,000 total is what they want, and let's say that's about 400,000 Afghan police and army, that'll be about 200,000 international forces. So I'd like to go back to the military and say, why are you only asking for 40,000 if your doctrine actually requires far more than that? And the answer probably is that's as much as they think they can get away with, which isn't really the kind of answer we want to hear.
If you were a betting fellow, how would you bet President Obama is going to respond to this request?
I'd say President Obama has no choice. If he's not going to send the troops, he should have stopped the general from sending in the report. He's now completely boxed in.
But he's indicating that there's not only a lot of wiggle room, but that he's actually reconsidering.
I think it would be a political catastrophe for the president to refuse to accede to a request from the man on the ground. Broadly speaking, this is a civilian president. He said that he believes in defeating the Taliban, he believes in building a legitimate, effective state. There's a highly respected general on the ground who's backed up by Admiral Mullen, who's backed by General Petraeus, saying we need 40,000 more troops. It would be almost inconceivable at this stage for the president to refuse that request.
So this is an image problem in part for the president?
It's an image problem. It's also the way he's framed the problem. He said that he wants to build a legitimate, effective state and defeat the Taliban. He's asked the experts what their view are. The experts have come back and said, if you want to do that, give me 40,000 more troops.
Well, but he's also said, certainly recently, maybe we need to reassess. We need to figure out exactly what we do want to. Isn't he giving himself a chance to maybe change the objective?
No, I don't honestly believe he is. And furthermore, I'm a little bit surprised that he's going around saying that he's skeptical. If he's actually skeptical and not sure about strategy, personally, I know it's inappropriate of me maybe to talk about this kind of stuff, but he shouldn't have allowed the general to produce the report in the first place. He could have easily said to General McChrystal 2-3 months ago, listen, to be honest, I'm not sure about this state building, defeating the Taliban stuff. So just hold a second. That isn't really the strategy anymore. I don't want to report on that. I don't want to know how many troops you need for that. I want to focus on a much narrower counterterrorism strategy. But it's too late now. He's defined it. The general's provided his advice. And I would be extremely surprised if the president doesn't come out in favor.
President Obama has made it clear that he wants two things to happen in Afghanistan, right? He wants us to rout the Taliban and build a safe country for the Afghanis. And, by the way, not have a place for al-Qaeda to operate from, correct?
Correct.
What's wrong with those goals?
So the problem is that these are all quite different objectives. In and of themselves, they're fine. But they're not connected necessarily in the way the president thinks. There's a huge theory that everything that we want to do is somehow connected. The stability of Pakistan, the security of the United States, beating the Taliban, beating al-Qaeda, bringing development to the Afghan people. And we end up in a bit of a muddle because we tend to be pursuing 5 objectives at once, assuming that they all amount to the same thing. The real problem is that some of these things just may not be possible. They may be possible over the long term for Afghans themselves to build a stable state, but it's probably a project of decades. It needs indigenous leadership, a sort of Afghan Thomas Jefferson, to rebuild a state. It's not something that foreigners can come in and do from outside. The United States, its allies, are quite good at certain kinds of things, building roads, providing some training to the military, helping to build hospitals and schools, but building a state is a project for a founding father. The same with fighting the Taliban. Again, they have quite a lot of support from villages in the south of Afghanistan.